Science Fantastic with Professor Michio Kaku.
This is Science Fantastic with Professor Michio Kaku. On Science Fantastic, we profile the amazing, jaw-dropping scientific discoveries that are revolutionizing our world and touching our lives. And in this hour, we're going to spend the entire hour talking about the number 2 killer in the U.S. of A. Number 1 is heart disease, but number 2, not too far behind, is cancer. In fact, if you talk to a random set of people, everyone knows somebody who had died of cancer. So with us today to talk about it is a science journalist with the New York Times. He's written extensively about cancer. The book is called The Cancer Chronicles, Unlocking Medicine's Deepest Mystery. And he starts with the fact that his wife was diagnosed with cancer, and as a consequence, he became an expert trying to understand for the layperson what cancer is, what the new therapies are, and that's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about lifestyle changes. We're going to talk about new revolutionary therapies. We're going to talk about nanoparticles which can zap cancer cells one by one, giving us hope that one day we'll be able to rein in cancer. So once again, our special guest today is George Johnson talking about cancer. Did you know that we now know what cancer is? We can't cure it yet, but it's a disease of our genes. That is, tobacco can cause cancer, radiation, lifestyle, bad diet can cause cancer. But what causes a cell to go cancerous? It is a disease of our genes. Radiation, all the poisons that we ingest, pollution, what they do is they monkey with our genes. And if you fix those genes, perhaps you can cure cancer. One of the bright spots on the horizon is something called immunotherapy and gene therapy, where we can actually augment and increase the power of our own immune system. Did you know that your immune system can attack cancer? That's right, your immune system can attack cancer, but eventually cancer figures out a way to become invisible to our immune system. So in the early stages, yeah, we can zap cancer naturally, but eventually we lose that ability. With gene therapy, we can regain that ability. So once again, our special guest today is George Johnson of the New York Times, and the book is called Cancer Chronicles. We're very glad to have with us today George Johnson, science journalist with the New York Times. Perhaps you've read many of his articles. They're on the web. His latest book called The Cancer Chronicles, Unlocking Medicine's Deepest Mystery. So we're going to talk about a personal tragedy that Mr. Johnson underwent, but also what about the science? Do we have a handle on cancer, or is it still the big mystery that science has yet to solve? So, Mr. Johnson, glad you could be on Science Fantastic.
Yes, thanks for inviting me.
And the first question that we always start off with is, how did you, as a youth, when you were in elementary school or whatever, how did you as a youth first get interested in science?
Well, I was really the typical young boy scientist, and in the late 50s and early 1960s, and I would see the pictures of scientists in white coats with all these interesting-looking, mysterious pieces of laboratory equipment and crackling electricity and glass tubes, and I thought, this is exactly what I want to do.
And then what steered you in the direction of science journalism?
Well, actually, I got to college thinking I was going to study science, and I remember taking an introductory chemistry class, and then when I got to the laboratory and saw what being a scientist actually entails, I thought, I don't know. And then I took physics class, an introductory advanced physics class, and I found it fascinating, but I really hated doing the problems at the end of the chapter. You know, you had to do these calculations of what happens to the ball on the frictionless plane when it hits the loop, and I thought, well, maybe this isn't what I want to sign up for. At the same time, I was hanging out at the school newspaper and the literary magazine and writing for those, and it sort of converged where I realized I wanted to write about science rather than do science.
Okay, fair enough. And your book, Cancer Chronicles, got good reviews, but tell us, it's based on a personal tragedy, right?
Well, yes, that's when I first got thinking about cancer and became fascinated by it in a scary sort of way. It was when my former wife, at the age of 43, was diagnosed out of the blue with a stage 4 metastatic cancer. And, you know, of course, when something like that happens, you and your wife or husband or brother or sister or whatever it is, you want to learn everything you can about the subject. And that's when I became, you know, just fascinated in cancer as a phenomenon, and of course dreaded what was happening to my wife. And, you know, fortunately there was a good ending to that.
Now, back then, there was not much in our arsenal. We had surgery. You could cut cancer, slice it up. You could have chemotherapy. You could poison cancer. And you can also have radiation. You can zap cancer, right?
Yes, and all three of those were things that Nancy had to go through.
But there was no cure, right?
No, there's really no cure for, I mean, cancer is just not something that's often cured, especially when it's in the metastatic state. You know, there were certain cancers in early stages that you could probably say are cured, but in general, you know, cure means extending life for a longer time. Now, in Nancy's case, you could say it was cured because, you know, more than a decade later, she's still healthy, but there's always this anxiety that lurking somewhere in your body is, or some of those cancer cells, and that they're in a dormant state, and something, we don't understand what, might reignite them. So I don't know. I don't like to use the word cure, and I think it's being thrown around in a rather irresponsible way now with talks of the moonshot for cancer and admirable things like this that I think are probably raising false hopes.
And chemotherapy is a process by which you poison healthy cells, but hopefully the cancer cells die quicker. But therefore, isn't it horrible? Your hair falls out, you feel nauseous.
Terrible. I mean, oh yes, I mean, some people describe an oncologist as being a person who's an expert in poisoning you to the brink of death and hoping they can bring you back and it'll be the cancer that's killed and not the patient. But it's also very, very effective. That's really, you know, probably what cured, if you can call it that, Nancy's cancer, or put it into this long, wonderful remission. But yeah, it's a sickening process, but, you know, it works. And the fact is, if someone were diagnosed today with the same cancer that Nancy had, they would undergo the same regimen of chemo, radiation, all, you know, preceded by surgery, because there's really nothing else they found that works for that cancer.
Now, back in the 1970s, I still remember all the hoopla around President Nixon declaring war on cancer. We put men on the moon, and we're going to cure cancer. Yeah. Some people think that, well, maybe cancer won. And, well, how have the death rates changed? Have we really gotten a handle on it, even though there's no outright cure? The death rates, are they pretty much the same as they were back in the 1970s, or are death rates dropping as we get a better handle on cancer?
Yeah, well, you know, they look at two things. They look at incidence rates, which is how often, you know, frequently a particular type of cancer occurs in the population, and then death rates, how often it kills people. The frequency of cancer in the population has remained more or less steady for the last couple of decades. There's been, you know, some glitches up and down, and usually, you know, they can be explained by, you know, various factors. And, you know, the death rates, it depends on the cancer. For some, they've remained stubbornly steady. The same percentage of people who get the cancer die from it. But there's been some big improvements in other cancers, like breast cancer.
Okay.
And some of this has to do with catching the cancer earlier, and it has to do with improved techniques for fighting it. But mostly these are old-fashioned, you know, chemo, radiation, and surgery, except done in a more refined sense.
Okay, well, let's talk about the easy stuff, and then, of course, we're going to get into the genetics of cancer in a moment. But the easy stuff, lifestyle changes. Are there some simple lifestyle changes that you can undergo to drastically reduce the rate of cancer?
The one thing that would drastically reduce the rate of cancer in the world population would be to eliminate smoking. And, if we did that, cancer would be just a vastly less prominent problem than it is. It would still exist, obviously. We'd still have breast cancer, ovarian cancer, and all kinds of other cancers. Another thing is the vaccine that prevents the virus that causes cervical cancer. That's something, if we could have close to universal vaccine against HPV, human papillomavirus, that could essentially wipe out cervical cancer. So there are these things here and there that could be done that would have drastically good effects, and many of them are very low-tech like that. Don't smoke, get this vaccine.
And talking about HPV, some people are saying that in addition to the pap smear, it's now possible to genetically sequence the HPV virus, which is directly linked to cervical cancer, and find out whether or not you have the cancer-causing variety of the HPV.
Yeah, that's a dilemma because, then again, cervical cancer is such a horrible thing. It killed a woman that I used to know when she was relatively young, and why not err on the side of prevention?
Right. And what about diet? Of course, that's the big one. What kinds of things should we do to change our diet?
Very little of that makes much of a difference. I mean, the one thing they found is that it's not so much what you eat, but how much you eat. Or there's also a controversy over whether it's really simply eating too much that causes obesity or whether it's more complicated than that. It has to do with, your energy balance and hormones getting screwed up in various ways. Like, my colleague Gary Taubes thinks the big culprit is sugar. But in any case, obesity has been linked, I think, to almost everyone's satisfaction in the field of cancer science with increased cancer risk. But as for particular foods, the evidence remains very, very shaky.
Okay, well, there have been some famous studies on Japanese women showing that they have a lower breast cancer rate.
Yes,
so
right.
Some people said, aha, maybe it's animal fat or maybe it isn't. But Japanese people, on the other hand, have a very high rate of stomach cancer.
Right.
So any thoughts about whether or not animal fat is linked to breast cancer or whether or not salty fish is related to stomach cancer? Any thoughts?
Yeah, the general sense as far as dietary fat, fat that you eat as opposed to, being fat for whatever reason, the link between dietary fat and cancer is very, very shaky and not nearly as strong as people were hoping, because, if you can find, easily identifiable factors like that, maybe you can get an edge on cancer. But no, there's not much evidence of that. Now, salty fish, or just salt in general, I think it's fair to say there's much more evidence that is a factor in stomach cancer. But, and so is HPV. But these studies you mentioned, the population studies they call them, where people will move from one country to another, and then they'll find that the next generation of the family has the cancers of the adopted country rather than the cancers that were prominent in the old country. So like Japanese moving to the United States, and then their children tend to have the same percentage of colon cancer and breast cancer as we do in the U.S., while their parents, have the same rates that they had back in Japan, which is, lower for breast, lower for colon cancer, but higher for stomach. And these studies are just tantalizing, but there's really not a satisfactory general answer for why this occurs. Could there be more stress in the new environment? Because stress has been linked to cancer susceptibility. Or could it be a change in your microbiome? All of these bacteria that, form, most of the cells in your body and that your other cells in your solid body interact with. It's very mysterious.
Okay, well, also, every once in a while, some tabloid newspaper latches on to a cancer hotspot. They say that if you take a map of the United States and look at the incidence of cancer, some people say, aha. Right. Other people say that it's hype and it's not rigorous science. But what are your thoughts about so-called cancer hotspots?
Well, yeah, cancer clusters, they often call them. And, epidemiologists have what they call the Texas sharpshooter effect, where you imagine a Texas, I don't know why Texas, but a Texan sharpshooter with a shotgun, and, maybe he's even, had a few beers, and he shoots at the side of a barn, just sort of randomly, and then he walks up to the barn and he sees where the bullet holes are clustered, and he draws a circle around them, and then there you have a bullet hole cluster. And there's a danger that the same thing happens with people looking for cancer clusters, because you'll find a point in the United States where there are more cancers of a certain kind than there are in a similarly sized circle you draw on another part of the map.
Okay. We're going to have to take another short commercial break, but after the break, we're going to continue with a fascinating book, Cancer Chronicles. We're going to talk about the mystery of cancer with New York Times science journalist George Johnson. Welcome back to Science Fantastic with Professor Michio Kaku. In this hour, once again, we're going to be talking about one of the greatest mysteries of modern science, and that is, what is cancer? We have with us today George Johnson, science journalist with the New York Times, author of a number of great books. The book that we're talking about is Cancer Chronicles, Unlocking Medicine's Deepest Mystery. Also, he's the author of The 10 Most Beautiful Experiments, and also Miss Leavitt's Stars, the untold story of the woman who discovered how to measure the universe. So, Mr. Johnson, in the previous segment, we talked about lifestyle changes, we talked about things that may precipitate cancer, but now we have the Genome Project. Now it's possible to actually look inside a cell's gene and figure out with the relationship between what the cell does and its genetic makeup. So isn't it true, therefore, that scientists have been able to show that ultimately, after everything is said and done, ultimately cancer is a disease of the genes? Could you elaborate?
Yes, that's right, and that was actually known long before the ability to sequence the cancer genome and the human genome. From some very, very interesting experiments in the 1960s. And, basically there's a certain number of genes that get knocked out or distorted somehow by mutations, and you get a certain combination of those mutated genes, and you get a cancer. Like, say, for example, there's a gene that regulates how quickly one of your cells divides. And there's another gene that monitors how many times the cell is divided. There might be another gene that looks for signs of inner turmoil in the mitochondria of the cell, and in other parts of the cell. And if things seem to be really out of whack, it can sense this chemically and then get the cell to commit suicide, which is called apoptosis, from a Greek word that referred to leaves falling from trees, like dead cells falling from the organism. And all of these things, these genes are made to control in a very orderly manner how all of the cells in your body divide and interact with each other, so no one gets out of hand and starts crowding out the others. It's when genes like these are knocked out by mutations that you become susceptible to cancer. And if you get a certain combination of them, the cell tips over and it just starts crazily dividing.
Now, there is one gene that is rather interesting. It's called P53. It's a very long gene. Yeah. But apparently, when it is mutated, It's implicated in 50% of all common cancers. Now, it is not the cancer gene, because there are many of them.
Yeah.
There's dictionaries of cancer genes, in fact. But some of them are outstanding, right, and may one day give us a handle on cancer. But what are your thoughts?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's a very important one. And there's, originally they would talk about, half dozen or a dozen genes that were implicated in cancer, and they continue to find more of them. But, the difficult thing is that these genes are also implicated and connected in very healthy activities of the body. Like P53 regulates, the cell cycle, how it divides and, in a certain rhythm and makes daughter cells which go on to divide. P53 is directing that, and P53 is involved, and when a cell very normally reaches the end of its life and it's time to take it offline before it goes crazy, and then you kill the cell with apoptosis. So, all of these things are intertwined in the normal workings of the cell, and they can be intertwined in the abnormal workings. And, one gene might be mutated like P53, or it might be another gene.
One of these new therapies is gene therapy. That is, you take blood from the body, you actually modify the genes of your T cells, your immune cells, put it back into the body, and lo and behold, it seems to attack cancer. So could you elaborate on some of the excitement generated by these still experimental new therapies?
Yes, the immune system therapies, it's something that scientists were looking at for a long time, and it kind of fell in and out of fashion, meaning that scientists were excited about the possibilities and then discouraged. And lately it's undergone a resurgence in which, it seems like it's clearly something that's here to stay. It's, again, very puzzling in other cancers' mysteries. These therapies, they found that they work against certain advanced cases, for example, of melanoma, deadly skin cancer. And for a small percentage of the people with this cancer at a very, high stage of cancer development, very malignant, it adds years to their lifetimes, while before the best therapies might have added weeks or months. And, it's too early to say how many years it could be, or whether this will be indefinite, or in any case it will buy them a lot more time. But this is only a small percentage of the patients, and on most of the other patients it doesn't really have that effect. So the real challenge now, or one of the real challenges, is figuring out why some patients are very responsive to this therapy and other patients are not. And again, it sounds like this, wonderfully friendly thing, toying with your immune system so it kills the cancer cells with the body's natural defense. But, these therapies, like others, have very bad side effects because, a lot of them, basically turn down the intensity of the immune system. Or no, I'm sorry, I said it backwards. They turn up the intensity of the immune system so it will attack these cancer cells. But, on the other hand, when you do that, you have the danger of autoimmune reactions where your system's going to attack healthy cells. And but, they're working on fine-tuning that and combating the side effects. So it's definitely something to be cautiously optimistic about. And if you get melanoma or one of the other cancers, to hope that you're in that small percentage of responders to this treatment.
So there's gene therapy when you actually modify the genes of your immune system and put it back in the body. There's also immunotherapy, very closely related, where you strengthen the immune system. So in some sense,
these are both forms of immune therapy. So
right.
The gene therapy is where you tweak a gene and immune system cells. You take the blood, you take it outside of the body, tweak it in the lab, and fine tune it to attack the cancer. And then there's another kind of immune therapy called checkpoint inhibitors, where you're basically unleashing the immune system, and that's what I was referring to when we were talking about the dangers of the body attacking itself.
Well, Mr. Johnson, some people are saying that with liquid biopsies and DNA chips, we'll be able to sample your bodily fluids, saliva, blood, whatever, when you go to the bathroom, maybe, and detect traces of cancer genes, and as a consequence, find the location of cancer colonies of maybe a few hundred cancer cells years before a tumor finally forms. So what are your thoughts about cancer prevention using high-tech, technology that comes from Silicon Valley, in fact, that allows us to detect traces, fingerprints of cancers when there are only 100 of these cancer cells in your body, not 10 billion like in a tumor? What are your thoughts?
Yes, that to me is the one high-tech approach that I'm most optimistic about, the idea of using our technology to detect cancer at a very, very early stages. And because, again, if you can prevent cancer, from happening in the first place, that's really the thing to concentrate on. Because once you get cancer and once it gets to the point where it's metastasizing or spreading throughout your body, it's just such a difficult problem and often an intractable one. So yeah, I'm very optimistic about that. It's as you suggest, it's very early, and we have to see how these things develop.
Okay, now, some people take a more pessimistic approach. I'm optimistic. However, some people say that look at the common cold. We don't cure the common cold because there are 300 different varieties of the rhinovirus, and there are thousands of varieties of cancer.
Yeah.
So maybe in the future, some pessimists say, we'll simply live with it. We'll cure a few cancers. We'll simply be in a stalemate with other cancers, but we'll never cure it because there's so many. It's a disease of our genes, and there are many ways in which our genes can malfunction. So some people say that it's like a Cold War. We're not going to really fear it like we used to. It's not going to be the killer that affects mortality rates. However, it's very difficult to actually cure. What are your thoughts?
Oh, I don't think cancer ever will be cured. And I think I would call those people the optimists. If we can get to the point where most cancers can be managed as chronic diseases in the way that we've been able to do in recent years with AIDS, that would be a wonderful thing. The way I look at cancer, and one of the major themes in my writings about it, and including my book, is that cancer is an inevitable trade-off of evolution. I mean, we're multicellular creatures, and multicellular creatures consist of on the order of 1 trillion cells, all intricately choreographed to interact with each other, so one cell doesn't grow too fast and crowd out the other cell, that they all communicate, they send these intricate signals, but any complex system like that is going to commit errors, and because of entropy, the second law of thermodynamics, complexity over time inevitably gives way to disorder, and the systems we build up break down. The same is true of our bodies, and cancer is always going to be with us because it's a phenomenon that exists in multicellular creatures living in a world that's ruled by entropy.
Okay, and now let's say a few things about, science fiction. I have some colleagues of mine at Bethesda, Maryland, where we have the National Institutes of Health, that experiment on nanoparticles. That is, we're talking about molecules that home in on individual cancers, deliver a tiny, tiny amount of poison to them, and they're like smart bombs, they say. Now, this is very experimental, but one of my colleagues got funding for this, and she actually tinkers with deformed P53 genes. So what are your thoughts, therefore, about the future now, where we have
targeted therapies that existed in one form or another for a while, like there's the Herceptin, which is a drug that zooms in on the HER receptors on breast cancer cells, and there's advanced versions of the drug that deliver a little tiny bit of poison to the cells that are overexpressed, that have too many of these HER receptors, which is typical of breast cancer cells, and then it finds these cells and blows them up. So it's like delivers this depth charge. But, the problem has always been, and again, it's one of these trade-offs you always run into, is that the normal healthy cells also have these HER2 receptors, so you're going to poison some of those as well. So the trick seems to be finding, cells that have some kind of mutation or express some kind of molecule on their surfaces that just don't exist in healthy cells. And that's sort of like some therapies work, including the one for very very deadly form of leukemia. So this is definitely one of the waves of the future.
Okay, and if you had the ear of the American public and were to summarize some of the advances, what would you suggest people do? If you had the ear of the president, you had a bullhorn, would you suggest that people change their lifestyle, they get more educated? What are your thoughts in terms of if you had the ear of the American public?
I'd say mostly let's concentrate on finding ways of preventing cancer. Make smoking illegal. Make it a felony to buy or sell children.
Okay,
and young adults.
Mr. Johnston, unfortunately we've run out of time. But thank you so much for being on Science Fantastic. Once again, our special guest today has been George Johnston of the New York Times. His book is called The Cancer Chronicles: Unlocking Medicine's Deepest Mystery.